August 3rd, 1944, the eastern edge of the Vistula River Valley in southern Poland, 4 weeks into Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive that has, in the previous month, destroyed more German divisions than any single military operation in the history of warfare up to that point. The air smells of diesel exhaust and scorched earth, and the particular sweetness of summer wheat that was supposed to be harvested, but has instead been burned across hundreds of kilometers of Polish countryside. A column of Soviet T-34 tanks is moving west along a road that was a German supply route 72 hours ago. The lead tank in the column, moving through a shell-cratered village that has no remaining buildings taller than a man's waist, is commanded by a 34-year-old tank brigade colonel named David Dragunsky, who has been in continuous combat for 11 days and who has not slept for longer than 2 hours at a stretch in the past week, and who is going to receive, within the hour, a message that he has been both expecting and dreading since the autumn of 1941, when the village of Sviatsk stopped appearing in any communication from anyone who had ever lived there. Colonel David Dragunsky was 34 years old. He was born on February 15, 1910, in the village of Sviatsk in the Bryansk Oblast of the Russian Empire, the son of Abram Dragunsky, who kept a small dry goods operation and who raised his children, 7 of them, in the specific texture of Jewish village life in the western reaches of the former Russian Empire, the Shabbat candles on Friday evening, the market day negotiations, the particular combination of deep communal rootedness and persistent civic vulnerability that had characterized Jewish life in these territories through the revolution and into the early Soviet years. David had grown up speaking Russian and Yiddish with equal fluency, had been an exceptional mathematics student, and had joined the Red Army in 1933 at the age of 23, because the army offered education and advancement that the village and the country's other institutions offered Jewish men only uncertainly and unevenly. He completed the Saratov Armored Cavalry School and then the Advanced Tank Commanders Program, and discovered in himself a specific and genuine gift for the three-dimensional spatial problem-solving that armored warfare required. The ability to read terrain the way a reader reads text, to understand instantly and accurately where a column of tanks could move, where it would be exposed, where it could use the ground to strike rather than be struck. He had commanded tanks in the Soviet-Finnish War of 1939 to 1940, a campaign that had been a strategic embarrassment for the Soviet military and an educational experience for the officers who survived it. By June 1941, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa and the full weight of the Wehrmacht fell on the Soviet western border in the largest military invasion in human history, Dragunsky was a mid-level tank officer with 8 years of service and a precise understanding of his own capabilities. He also had, in Sviatska, a father, a mother, 4 brothers, and the remainder of the extended family network that a 7-child household in a small village produces across 2 generations. He learned, through the fragmentary communications available to a frontline officer in the chaos of the Soviet military's near collapse in 1941, that German forces had occupied the Bryansk Oblast in August of that year. After August 1941, he received no communication from Sviatsk. He continued receiving no communication from Sviatsk for 3 years, in the particular silence of no communication from a Jewish village in German-occupied Soviet territory between 1941 and 1944. A man who understood what that silence meant had to choose between 2 ways of carrying it, as grief which could disable him or as purpose which could not. Dragunsky chose the way his mathematics education had trained him. He converted the variable he could not yet know precisely into a constant he could work with and continued advancing through the problem. General Major Pyotr Vasilievich Kuznetsov was 51 years old, a career Red Army officer with 28 years of service behind him, a man shaped entirely by the Soviet military culture of the 1920s and 1930s, which included in its ambient institutional texture the same casual anti-Semitism that had survived the revolution by changing its vocabulary while retaining its content. Kuznetsov was not an ideological anti-Semite in the explicit sense. He had never, in a formal documented setting, made a statement that would have placed him in difficulty with the party's official position on the national question. He was something considerably more common and, in some respects, more durable, a man who had absorbed, over 5 decades of Russian life, a collection of assumptions about Jews that operated not as convictions but as reflexes, which meant they did not require examination to produce their effects and could not be addressed by argument because they were not arguments but habits. He had commanded armies through the worst years of the Soviet military's near collapse under the German invasion and had fought his way back from Stalingrad with the specific hardened certainty of a man who survived something that killed everyone around him and who attributes his survival to his own qualities rather than to probability. He was not a poor commander by the standards of the Red Army in 1944. He was a man who had documented difficulties working with Jewish officers whose demonstrated performance the military's own metrics recognized and rewarded, and who responded to this difficulty not by reconsidering his assumptions, but by creating bureaucratic friction wherever his assumptions and the performance metrics diverged. The friction he created around Dragunsky's command had been operating in the quiet machinery of recommendation delays and assignment reviews for approximately 2 years before August 1944. It had not stopped Dragunsky. It had made Dragunsky cover twice the ground to reach each position that a non-Jewish officer of equivalent demonstrated performance would have needed to cover, which was an accurate measurement of what institutional anti-Semitism costs when applied to a man who refuses to pay it. By the summer of 1944, the Eastern Front had been for 3 years the site of both the largest military conflict and the largest deliberate mass murder in human history, and these two facts were not separate from each other. The German occupation of Soviet territory between 1941 and 1944 had included the systematic murder of the Soviet Union's Jewish population with a thoroughness that the German military command had made a specific operational priority, even when doing so complicated supply logistics and diverted manpower from frontline requirements. In the occupied territories of Belarusia, Ukraine, and Western Russia, the Jewish communities that had existed for generations had been eliminated in a sequence of mass shootings, ghetto liquidations, and deportations to the killing centers in occupied Poland. The Soviet state incorporated this elimination into the general category of German atrocities against Soviet citizens, which was accurate but which also dissolved the specific targeted character of the murder into a larger category that obscured its particular logic. Jewish soldiers in the Red Army fought in the knowledge that the territory they were advancing to liberate contained, in most cases, nothing of the communities they had come from, except the physical evidence of what had happened to those communities. This knowledge was not officially acknowledged as a specific burden on Jewish servicemen. It was simply present, the way certain facts are present in a military formation, known to everyone, addressed by no one, carried in the manner of things that have no sanctioned place in the day's operational order. Dragunsky had been carrying it for 3 years. The message reached his tank through the brigade radio operator at 7 minutes past noon on August 3, 1944, relayed from a Soviet intelligence officer attached to units operating in the Bryansk Oblast, who had been tasked with documenting German occupation atrocities for propaganda and eventual legal purposes. The message was factual and brief. It stated that the Jewish community of Sviatsk had been liquidated by German forces in August 1941, that the massacre had taken place in a ravine east of the village, and that there were no known survivors among the village's pre-war Jewish residents: his father, his mother, 4 brothers, the extended family of a 7-child household in a small village. The message did not use the word family. It used the administrative language of population documentation. Dragunsky read it in the cupola of his T-34 while the column continued moving west through the burned wheat fields. The column did not stop. He folded the message and placed it inside his uniform jacket against his chest and gave the order, over the brigade radio, to increase the column's pace by 5 kilometers per hour. The brigade increased its pace. They covered 11 kilometers in the next hour, more than any comparable period of that day's advance, a fact that was noted in the brigade's daily operational log without explanation. 3 days later, on August 6, 1944, Dragunsky's brigade broke through the last intact German defensive line in their operational sector, completing an encirclement that trapped 2 German infantry regiments and seized a crossing over the San River that the operational plan had assessed as requiring 3 additional days to secure. The after-action report submitted by Kuznetsov's headquarters attributed the breakthrough to favorable terrain conditions and accurate artillery preparation. The recommendation for a Hero of the Soviet Union award that Dragunsky's immediate superior submitted the following day was reviewed at Kuznetsov's level and returned with a request for additional documentation of the specific command decisions involved, a standard procedural move that added 6 weeks to the processing time of an award that, for other officers whose operations were assessed as directly comparable, had been approved within 10 days. The award was eventually approved. The delay was noted in the records of the Military Personnel Office. It was not formally explained. The first Hero of the Soviet Union star was presented to Colonel Dragunsky on August 28, 1944. The ceremony took place in a field in southern Poland in front of his assembled brigade, with a frontline political officer conducting the presentation in the manner prescribed by Red Army regulation. Kuznetsov was not present. He was present at the ceremonies for 2 other hero presentations conducted the same afternoon for officers under his command, whose awards had been recommended and processed without supplemental documentation requests. The assembled brigade of Dragunsky's soldiers, approximately 3,000 men, Russian, Ukrainian, Kazakh, Georgian, Tatar, and a handful of others, stood at attention in the Polish field while the medal was pinned to his chest. Several of them, interviewed decades later by Soviet military historians compiling oral records of the Eastern Front, described the quality of the silence during that ceremony as different from the silence at any other medal presentation they had attended, without being fully able to articulate in what the difference consisted. One veteran, a Ukrainian tank driver named Vasil Petrenko, who had served under Dragunsky from 1943 to the end of the war, said in his recorded interview that it was the silence of men who understood something about what their commander had inside his jacket and what the medal was being pinned over, without knowing precisely what they knew or how they knew it. He said Dragunsky's face during the ceremony was the face of a man who had decided what the medal was for independently of whatever the ceremony thought it was for. The Vistula Oder offensive began on January 12, 1945, and lasted until February 2nd, covering 500 kilometers in 23 days, the fastest major offensive advance of the entire war on any front. Dragunsky's brigade advanced with the front through the ruins of German-occupied Western Poland, where the physical evidence of what the occupation had meant to the Polish Jewish population was visible from the cupola of a moving tank as a particular kind of absence, the absence of people where people should have been, the absence of communities where communities should have been, the specific silence of emptied places in what had been, before the war, among the most densely populated Jewish regions on Earth. He advanced through this absence at the speed the operational plan required, noting it without having the orders or the time to do anything with the notation except continue moving west. He reached the Oder River in February, and the assault on Berlin became the next operational objective on the planning maps of the Soviet command. Berlin fell to Soviet forces in the final days of April and the first days of May 1945. Dragunsky's 55th Guards Tank Brigade was among the units that fought into the city itself, moving through streets that the fighting had reduced to a rubble landscape that his tank crews navigated by dead reckoning and the compass bearings of a city whose street plan had been memorized from operational maps during 3 months of preparation for the assault. The fighting inside Berlin was the most costly urban combat his brigade had engaged in since Stalingrad 3 years earlier. every intersection a defensive position, every basement a potential ambush, the rubble that made movement difficult also making the terrain readable in a way that a trained armor commander could use. He commanded from his tank through 5 days of continuous fighting inside the city, sleeping in the cupola in 2-hour intervals. He was thinking, during those 5 days, about a message folded against his chest inside his uniform jacket that he had been carrying for 9 months. Not because he still needed to read it, but because he had not yet decided what to do with it, and because the city his tanks were destroying was the city whose ideology had sent the men who had done what the message described to a ravine outside a village in the Bryansk Oblast in August of 1941. He did not discuss this with his crew. He gave his orders and read his terrain and commanded his brigade through 5 days of Berlin at the pace and quality that the operational records would document as exemplary. The second Hero of the Soviet Union award was announced on April 31, 1945. The award citation described his performance in the Berlin operation with the formal language of Soviet military commendation. It did not describe the message inside his jacket. No citation could have described what the message in his jacket was for. David Dragunsky continued serving in the Soviet army after the German surrender, eventually rising to the rank of Colonel General. He wrote his memoirs, published in the Soviet Union under a title translating as Honest Soldier, in which he described the Eastern Front campaigns with the measured candor that the Soviet publishing environment of the 1970s permitted. He described the anti-Semitism he had encountered in the military with a specificity unusual for a Soviet-published memoir, noting that it had been present and that it had produced real effects on his career trajectory, and that he had chosen to respond to it through performance rather than protest, because performance was the only language the military apparatus could not reclassify. He described Sviatsk briefly in 2 paragraphs in a chapter that otherwise addressed the summer 1944 offensive in operational terms. He did not describe the 9 months of carrying the message inside his jacket. The post-war period produced for Dragunsky a complication that the wartime record had not included. He was used by the Soviet state in the late 1960s and 1970s as a public spokesperson in campaigns against Zionism, a role that he accepted and performed, and that produced a legacy that remains genuinely difficult to assess, because the man who accepted that role was the same man who had written with unusual candor about military anti-Semitism and who had driven his tanks from the graves of his family to the city that ordered those graves. Whether this constituted contradiction or survival or something more complicated than either of those words describes is a question the historical record presents without answering. He died on October 12, 1992, in Moscow at the age of 82, 1 year after the dissolution of the Soviet Union that had made him a hero and used him as a symbol, and that had never, in any official document, acknowledged the specific weight of what it had asked him to carry. The village of Sviatsk was rebuilt after the war. The Jewish community of Sviatsk was not rebuilt because there was no one left to rebuild it. Pyotr Kuznetsov survived the war and retired with the rank of lieutenant general. His personnel file contains no notation of any formal inquiry into the pattern of recommendation delays surrounding the promotions and awards of Jewish officers under his command during 1943 and 1944, because no formal inquiry was ever initiated. He died in 1963. Some historians of Soviet military performance in the Second World War have argued that the role of Jewish officers in the Red Army's fighting capacity has been systematically underrepresented in both Soviet-era and post-Soviet historical documentation, partly because the Soviet state's official narrative around Jewish participation subordinated Jewish identity to the broader category of Soviet citizenship, and partly because the post-war political uses of prominent Jewish veterans like Dragunsky created a complicated documentary record that later historians have found difficult to separate from the political purposes it was made to serve. They note that Jewish soldiers served in the Red Army in proportions significantly higher than their share of the Soviet population, and that the rate of Hero of the Soviet Union awards among Jewish servicemen was, per capita, among the highest of any identifiable group in the Soviet military, a fact that existed in permanent and unacknowledged tension with the institutional anti-Semitism that the same military operated with in its daily administrative life. Others have focused on the specific moral complexity of Dragunsky's post-war role in Soviet anti-Zionist campaigns, arguing that this role cannot be separated from the wartime record without distorting both, and that the honest assessment of a man who received 2 hero medals driving his tanks from the mass graves of his family to the city that ordered those graves, while simultaneously being delayed in his own awards by the bureaucratic expression of the same prejudice he was fighting to destroy, requires holding all of these things at once without resolving the tension they create into something simpler than the actual life produced. What is certain is that David Dragunsky drove his tanks from Sviatsk to Berlin over a distance of 2,000 kilometers and 4 years, carrying a message inside his uniform jacket for 9 months of that journey, and that the city his tanks destroyed in April and May of 1945 was the origin point of the ideology that had sent the men who made the message necessary to a ravine outside a village that had existed for generations and exists now only in the records of what happened to it and in the memories of the men who drove their tanks toward it from the other direction. If you had been Dragunsky receiving that message in August 1944 in the cupola of a moving tank in a Polish wheat field, what would you have done with it? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you believe the men who drove 2,000 kilometers carrying that specific kind of weight deserve to be remembered by the full measure of what they were carrying, subscribe, because this story has a distance in it that can only be accurately measured if you know where it started.